My name is Sam Stevens. I am the interim executive director at the William Trent House Museum in Trenton, New Jersey. Today, I'll be talking about the story of Northern colonial enslavement using examples from the William Trent House. The house was built in 1719. It is the structure you see there at the top right-hand picture by Trent, a wealthy shipping merchant from Philadelphia. He had originally come here from Scotland. He became very wealthy in Philadelphia. He participated in the slave trade. We don't believe he brought enslaved people directly from Africa, but as you'll see later, he was involved in the domestic slave trade. He settled at the Falls of the Delaware, which is where Trenton is now, on the ancestral lands of the Lenape people. And as you know, the Lenape were the original inhabitants of New Jersey. They called the land here Lenape-Hoking. During the colonial and early federal periods, many were removed west and north. Some did remain in their continuing historic tribal communities here in the region. And so we acknowledge the Lenape as the original people of the land that our museum stands on and their continuing relationship with the site. The Trent House mission is to share the authentic story of the house, the property, and the people with our communities, connecting the past with today and tomorrow. In particular, we want to make sure that we tell the stories of all the people whose lives have been connected with the house, but also with the property. We use primary sources to answer some questions and achieve some goals in our presentations. Primary sources, as I'm sure you know, are documents and other materials that directly communicate to us what life was like at the time through letters, deeds, wills, newspaper articles, etc. So there's a lot of information that we can use in primary sources to go right back to what people were saying and thinking and writing at the time. So we wanted to use these to confirm that Trent did participate in slavery, as did many others in the northern colonies, to present enslaved people as individuals, to illustrate both hardship and indignity of slavery, but also the resilience and fortitude of enslaved people, and to demonstrate how slavery was built on both institutional support and personal decisions. So let's start with the domestic and international slave trade. So the key points that we want to communicate here are that trading in enslaved Africans was an accepted business practice. It had legal restrictions, legal regulations, standard practices that were followed by many people as just part of the ordinary business dealings. Enslaved people were considered commodities, just like other items of trade or commerce. The colonial elite were major participants in and beneficiaries from the slave trade. And the slave trade was also domestic. That is, it involved transactions between colonists in the Americas. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we know from Trent's slave trade ledgers that among the goods he bought and sold were enslaved people originally from Africa. He owned shares in about 40 ships, which allowed him to spread the risk of losing what was in those ships through shipwreck, piracy, and misadventures. We don't know, however, if any of those ships went to Africa and transported kidnapped people from there to the New World. What we do know from the ledgers that are in the archives of the Historical Society of Pennsylvania is that he did buy and sell enslaved people with other people in Philadelphia, and we'll see a little bit more about that. Purchases of enslaved people beyond Philadelphia most likely took place in the West Indies. Trent traded extensively with the West Indies. He would take raw materials and finished goods from the colonies in North America down to the West Indies, where he would pick up molasses, rum, sugar, bring them back up to Philadelphia. And he also traded similarly with England. So this is a reproduction. It's not exactly what the trade ledgers looked like, but it has the information that the trade ledgers contain. The year of a particular transaction, who was selling something to William Trent, or was William Trent selling something to someone else? These trade ledgers list the description of the enslaved person who was the subject of the transaction and the amount in English pounds of the time that was exchanged in that transaction. So you'll see these are just a few of the entries in the ledgers that we have between 1702 and 1708. And it shows people selling enslaved people to Trent and Trent selling enslaved people to someone else. Here's what that looks like in a diagram that sort of shows how Trent was connected with many important, wealthy, politically powerful people in Philadelphia through buying and selling of enslaved people. So Trent's the red box in the middle. The yellow boxes around the side are the people he was either buying or selling enslaved people with. And you can see, I hope you can see that these included council people, assemblymen, the mayor of Philadelphia, people who were in own businesses, etc. And the blue boxes are what was enlisted in the trade ledgers describing the content of the transaction, who was being bought or sold. The arrows that go out from Trent indicate selling. The arrows that come into Trent indicate buying. So we have some posters that we also present to our visitors that sort of open up some of these individual transactions. So in this case, we have a man named John Guest. He was a judge and a provincial councilor and an assemblyman. So he had a lot of power. He sold to William Trent an enslaved boy for 40 pounds. A boy was probably between maybe 9 and 14 or so, old enough to work, but not fully grown yet. And Guest sold that boy to Trent for 40 pounds English money in 1705-06. Now, it turns out that William Trent then sold what we believe was the same boy to Captain John Finney in that same period for the same amount of money. John Finney was also a provincial councilor, also an assemblyman, as well as high sheriff of Philadelphia. Again, a very powerful person. We don't know, by the way, the names of all but one person that was involved in being sold in these transactions. This is sort of a reminder of the status that these people were considered during these transactions. They were property. It wasn't important to know their names. What was important to know their gender, their approximate age, and what was the monetary value in that transaction. So here's some observations, and you may want to discuss some of these. Enslavement was an individual decision based on economic calculation, supported by law and custom, and justified by the concept of racial hierarchy. In other words, William Trent made the decisions to buy and sell people. The people he was buying and selling to have made that decision. And they made it based on a proposition related to economic value. It was supported by law and customs. It was justified by the concept of a racial hierarchy in which people from Europe, white people from European countries, were assumed to be um, more fully human than others, and in some cases were considered to be human where other people were not considered to be human in the same way. And this concept of a racial hierarchy um, justified this idea that people could own other people and use them as property. Now, there were some colonists and Europeans who were beginning to raise concerns, objections to enslavement, but it turns out that for many people, regardless of their personal thoughts on the subject, their consideration of finances was often the most important consideration. So we know that slavery produced wealth and supported status. So here's some key points that we want to tell you a little bit more about. Um, so some slave owning northern colonists only had a few enslaved people. Maybe they also had some indentured Africans or Europeans, um, people who might have helped them on the farm, in the house, in the mill, and whatever. Others, like Trent, however, held more. And we'll learn about the enslaved people that he held in a minute or so. The enslaved people obviously are providing free labor on farms and mills and in other wealth producing activities. Enslaved people also serve to signify and demonstrate the status of their enslaver. And the monetary value assigned to the enslaved people reflected what the people who were buying them, owning them, assessed their productivity, strength, and skills. So Trent was an enslaver. When he died unexpectedly in 1724, he left no will. So when his second wife sued the eldest son from his first marriage, they had to take an inventory of everything Trent owned to figure out how to divvy up the estate. And that listed all of his possessions and assessed their monetary value in English pounds, shillings, and pence. So here is a reproduction of a portion of that inventory. And this part of the inventory is called an account of Negroes, viz., meaning as follows. And then it lists 11 enslaved people in 3 groups. A man named Yaff, a woman named Joan, a boy named Bob, a boy named Dick, a girl Nanny, a child Tom. These 6 are the only set that is a mixed gender age group. We believe they probably worked and lived in the Trent's house as domestic servants. Now, there are another 5 people, all of whom are adult men, listed in these 2 groups: Julius, Boson, and Harry, and then Cupid and Pedro. Now, there's a note that says they were Indiano men. Perhaps, but not likely at this point to have been Native American, but perhaps brought by Trent from the West Indies. These 5 men, worked in Trent's mills, in his stables, on his farms, etc. As you can see, this poster gives visitors a sense of Trent's wealth and illustrates how enslaved people were a major portion of that wealth. So from Trent's inventory, we were able to group together different kinds of items that were listed there. Now, these things only include the quote movable property. It doesn't include the land, the mills, the house, etc. But all of those things that he owned totaled in today's money, based on an algorithm we found online, about $236,000. Now, of that, almost one third was in the group of 11 enslaved people. This poster illustrates that people were considered property in the same way as livestock and household goods. This is a mannequin dressed as a butler in livery of the time. This is our representation of Yaff, the man listed in the first set of 6 people on Trent's probate inventory. You'll notice he's wearing very fancy clothing. Part of that was to illustrate his Trent's status. Having a butler dressed in livery was a sign of being a member of the elite. And here is Joan, also dressed on a mannequin representing her. We believe that she was the cook in the household. She was the only adult woman. We see on for her that her assessed value of 35 pounds was greater than a boat, many times more than a herd of sheep. She probably was very skilled. She was also, by the way, more valuable than 2 of the other men, adult men listed on the inventory, and equal to one other. So we believe that she was a skilled cook. There were many, many specialty kitchen items listed on the inventory. And because of that, we believe that she was very skilled at preparing fancy meals for Mr. Trent and his guests. People ask us if we know anything about the relationship between Joan, Yaff, Bob, Dick, the 2 boys, Nanny, the girl, etc., any of the other men on the estate. We do not, unfortunately. Now, we do know that, as I just mentioned, with Joan preparing fancy meals for Trent and his guests, was a way in which they contributed to Trent's status and comfort. So again, the having a butler was something that was very much emulated in the colonies based on what they were seeing rich people in England doing in their homes. Now, this manner in which Yaff is dressed may look a little odd to you. He has a turban on, for example. We see this in paintings of the time of house servants in England, particularly those who were from Africa, dressed this way in a sort of to emphasize their exotic nature, so to speak. In fact, many of those paintings show a silver collar around the neck of the enslaved servant. Here's Joan again. Both she and Yaff would have had major responsibilities for the overall operation of the house. Yaff was sort of in charge of the whole household. Joan certainly was critical to the operation of the household. She probably supervised and worked with the boys, who were 2 boys listed on the inventory, who were out running around, bringing in food from the garden, etc., chopping up things for her, helping her stir the pots, etc. So she was in charge of a number of the servants as well. Now, we also know that enslaved people contributed to Trent's business income. So he wasn't up there in New Jersey just to retire. He had mills on the local creek called Assapink Creek. Was a grist mill, grinding corn and wheat for flour, a sawmill, fulling mill processing cloth. He had a bakehouse that baked up that flour from the mill into bread that he would ship down to Philadelphia to sell. So, in this letter that he wrote to James, his oldest son from his first marriage, William Trent is saying, you must get Harry to help them in the bakehouse till the stuff is baked up, the stuff meaning the bread. And he was then going to ship it down to Philadelphia to sell. Now, you'll notice that Harry is one of the enslaved people. He was clearly had a important role in the bakehouse and in producing Trent's wealth. So, some observations. Each of the enslaved people had a value assessed based on what the people who were doing the assessment felt they were worth in terms of their productivity, what strength they had, what skills they had. We can use that inventory to give us a few clues about the individuals. But as you'll see later, there are some other primary sources that tell us much more. Now, Trent had outstanding debts at the time he died so unexpectedly, and his estate needed to be divvied up between his heirs. He had 3 adult sons from his first marriage, as well as his second wife and their son. So what did it mean that a large share of Trent's estate was invested in enslaved people? And what were his most liquid or easily sold assets? And that's a consideration that we imagine that those 11 people were having. What will happen to us now that Trent has died? So the lives of enslaved people, there are things we want to point out. We want to point out that the conditions of slavery were exploitative, demeaning, but that enslaved people created their own ways of maintaining their dignity and being as independent as they could be in the situation. And they resisted their situation in different ways, some subtle, some more direct, and some with force. So, to illustrate the hardships and indignities of enslavement, one of the ways we do this is showing pallets on the floors of the house where the people who worked in the house would probably have slept. There wasn't any separate rooms set aside for them, we don't believe. There are no extra rooms really in the house. There's an attic, but it's very small. So we believe that some of the enslaved people would have slept on the floor on pallets. So basically, they are sacks of straw with a blanket or so. And they might have had a number of personal possessions that they kept in a wooden box like this. And we put some items in there to illustrate again that this was a person who had interests and things that they like to do in addition to their work. So this pallet is placed on the second floor between Mr. and Mrs. Trent's bedrooms. They had separate bedrooms. It was typical of the time. That meant that Yaff was on call 24/7. It also meant because the enslaved people, we believe this set of Thicks were living in the house, that they were under the supervision constantly of the people who claimed to own them. So we asked visitors to think about whether it was the kind of work that enslaved people were told to do, or was it something else that was unique and definitive of slavery? And we try to get people to think about the fact that privacy, autonomy, being able to make your own decisions, regardless of how quote unquote well you were treated, whether you got to sleep in a house or at the mill, whether your work was outside on a farm or inside in a house, that was really the privacy and control and surveillance that really defined the conditions of slavery. Um, it's also the case that enslaved people um, often struggled with food sufficiency. If they might have been allowed to grow some food on their own or to fish or have chickens or whatever, but that was all at the discretion of the person who owned their time, owned them. Here in we contrast the very fancy meal that the Trents might have been eating at the time. This would have been one of four meals, the one you see on the left. On the right is a table that shows the kinds of items that would have been given to enslaved people, typically as rations. And those would have been the items at the top of the table with the white labels. Those items were insufficient in calories and insufficient in vitamins and protein to really support health and even to keep someone working at the level of work that they were expected to do. So we illustrate on the near end of the table with the orange um, labels some of the kinds of things that, if allowed, enslaved people would have grown: greens, okra, and so on, black-eyed peas. Some of these were brought from Africa and then the West Indies. Chili peppers, yams, might have been able to go fishing. They were right near the river, or grow chickens. So those kinds of hardships um, are illustrated here in terms of calorie shortages, vitamin shortages, and we used primary research from other sites to estimate those things. We don't have direct information from Trent's site. Again, speaking of Joan, here's all of the kinds of special equipment, kitchen equipment, that were listed on the inventory, and that is why we believe Joan was so highly valued as a skilled cook. Now, it's also true that resistance and resilience were something that many enslaved people were able to exhibit, that we have information directly on them. Now, this is an ad, an actual copy of the ad that was printed in 1729 in the New York Gazette. Yaff, you remember Yaff? Um, After Trent's death, he was sold or given to a man in New York, James Alexander, who put this ad in the paper. He was probably given to him around 1728 when Trent's estate was settled. And it didn't take long, maybe a year, maybe a little bit more than a year. But in June 1729, Yaff ran away, and Alexander put this ad in the New York Gazette. And this is what it says in where we can read it a little bit easier. Run away about this 9th of this instant June, meaning about June 9th of this year, 1729, from James Alexander of New York, a Negro man named Yaff, about 35 years old. He formerly belonged to Mr. Trent, before him to Colonel Inglesey. He was last seen at Elizabethtown, which is Elizabeth, New Jersey, after he ran away with a gray coat trimmed with red and an old white fustian coat. He was born in this country and reads and writes. He is a sensible, cunning fellow, and probably has got a pass forged. And then it goes on to say, whoever takes up the said Negro secures him so his said master may have him again, shall have £4 reward and all reasonable charges. So, first of all, this tells us something about Yaff and resistance. He was clearly taking the opportunity of being down in Elizabeth to run away. Now, there's a lot that we can learn about Yaff in this ad. We now know his approximate age, and we can work backwards to know how old he must have been when he belonged, as they say here, to Mr. Trent. We know that he had had at least two experiences of enslavement with two different people. We know that he had on a gray coat trimmed with red, which suggests to us livery. So again, perhaps again, Yaff was acting as butler or a senior household servant to Mr. Alexander. Yaff was born in this country, meaning in the colonies, and he reads and writes, not a common skill for everyone at the time. The word sensible and cunning suggests smart, clever, thinks for himself, probably has got a pass forged. In order to travel on his own, any person of African descent needed to have documentation that they were free or that they were allowed to be traveling on their own by their owner. So Yaff would have had, if he was down in Elizabethtown, potentially he went there, perhaps even on business for Alexander, and then took off from there. But he had passes. He could read and write. Unlike, very likely, he got his pass that was forged was made by him, given that he had the skills and he was sensible, smart, and cunning, clever. So one of the things that we've learned is how challenging it is to balance the presentation of human suffering experienced by those who were enslaved with evidence about their individual characteristics and their shared resilience. So, for example, there are many things now we know more about Yaff, but there's a lot we don't know. His, what were his, did he love music? Did he like to dance? Was he married to one of either Joan or Nanny? Was the child Tom listed on the inventory his child? So many things we don't know. We don't know where he went, where he was trying to get to, and we don't know what happened to him after that ad was placed. And because of all of that, much of what we know comes from the perspective of slaveholders. And there are first person accounts from enslaved people that you should consider. Resistance in the law. Now, this is another section that I'm going to go through that really gives a lot of detail about how resistance by enslaved people was treated under the law in colonial times. So enslaved people's resistance included acts against property and acts against people. So acts against property would include running away, stealing, etc., or arson, for example. Acts against people would be anything that was resulted potentially in injury or death. Now, colonial property law applied to enslaved people. They were considered property. And criminal law addressed their resistance. Over time, acts of resistance by enslaved people were met by increasingly restrictive and harsh laws and corporal punishment, including capital punishment, in the colonies. At the same time, of course, the colonial economy and individual households like that of Trent depended on the labor of enslaved people. And so this dynamic really created and supported individual and cultural beliefs and behaviors of the European colonists in justifying slavery. Now, I want to give you a case study of Trent and how these laws sort of apply to enslaved people related to Trent's death. So this article, which is copied here, was published in the Pennsylvania Gazette in the March of 1737. That was 13 years after Trent had died in 1724. And in it, it describes two men of African descent who were possibly enslaved, though it's not stated, that were overheard trying to convince others to poison their masters. And they boasted about this, that we have this poison that you can use And we've used it before, and we've killed Mr. Trent and a lot of other people. Now, someone must have overheard this or did overhear this. They were apprehended. They were discovered with arsenic and an unknown root and were apparently had confessed. So, how did Trent die? Well, he did die suddenly on Christmas Day, 1724, and what was called a fit of apoplexy, which is a sudden death, probably something like a stroke or a heart attack. You notice he was universally beloved and much lamented, and that may be true for some, but perhaps not for others. We don't know, for example, whether he was universally beloved by the people he enslaved. So was Trent poisoned? So here we're talking about a fit of apoplexy, might have been a stroke or a heart attack. In fact, the first article suggests that this charge that was brought up might be false, that the boasting by the enslaved people in promoting their poisons might have just been idle boasting, because at the time, all the people that they mentioned died apparently of common distempers, meaning common diseases. But the article does raise the possibility that Trent was poisoned. So what really happened? So this is what we want to look at. What evidence was used to convict the two men? They were convicted, and in fact hanged. Does this evidence support their claim of providing poison that killed William Trent? If the claim was not proven, why were they executed? And what does this suggest about the fear and the reality of resistance by enslaved people? So here's the evidence. The men were found with arsenic, which is a powerful poison, and an unknown root. And there appears to have been some kind of witness to this offer, perhaps an enslaved person himself or herself, who was afraid of being implicated in this conspiracy and reported it. And you'll see later that conspiracy to poison a white man or woman was a capital offense. So here's the root, possibly what the root might have looked like. It may have been brought to the colonies from either Africa or the West Indies. And so it's potentially this could have been one of the things that was suggested by the two people who were arrested as an efficacious poison. So could that have been the case? Could either the arsenic or the root have been a cause of the kind of death that Trent was described as experiencing, a fit of apoplexy? So it turns out that in sufficient quantity, arsenic can cause the convulsions, coma, and death, like would have been described as a fit of apoplexy. But there wasn't any suggestion of that at the time of the death. It was accepted as a death from natural causes. So at the same time, the two men could have said, well, you know, all those famous people that died 13, 14, 15, 10 years ago, well, we were the cause of them. That was being a good kind of evidence that would be hard to disprove and easy to claim as they were trying to sell their goods. So why were the men executed? So they were in fact executed in 1738, as also reported in the Pennsylvania Gazette. Two Negroes found guilty of practicing poison, by which they had destroyed sundry individuals, were executed there last week. We don't know what that evidence was, other than their own reports, their own confession. But they were executed for practicing poison. And as I mentioned before, even conspiracy to commit murder or conspiracy to create bodily harm or to incite others to commit it were capital offenses, regardless of whether the death had occurred. So this particular law was enacted in 1768, but it amended a 1713 act. It made court proceedings easier and quicker, so that you didn't have to bring someone in front of multiple people, in front of justices and freeholders, etc. That you could just go ahead with a single court, execute people who were and convict them of murder or conspiring or attempting the death of any of the colonists. And they could be convicted by either confession or verdict. In other words, regardless of what other evidence, a confession, which might have been gotten by torture or force, would have been sufficient to convict someone of a capital offense and have them executed. So why were such punishments considered necessary? And that it clearly illustrates the fact that there was fear among the colonists about enslaved people. Enslaved people were known to not be content with their status and were seeking ways to become free and to get released from their bondage. Fear of these harsh punishments was intended to be a deterrent to resistance. But we do know that many enslaved people resisted in their enslavement by force. So in 1712, there was a violent uprising of enslaved people, and that prompted the people in New York to write even stricter and harsher laws. And how did the fear of resistance coexist with trust? So Mr. Trent William Trent was a judge in New Jersey, and so he was responsible for enforcing these laws. At the same time, he lived in his house, we believe, with 6 enslaved people. Trent was the only adult white person. Yaff was the only adult Black person in the household. He trusted Yaff to take care of his house, to take care of his family while Trent might have been down in Philadelphia on business. He trusted him to do such intimate tasks as shaving him every day with a straight razor. This certainly would have given Yaff many opportunities to run away, to steal things, and to murder Trent with his straight razor. Was that because Trent was confident in Yaff's loyalty? Was Trent counting on the fear of these harsh laws to hold back Yaff's hand? But we also need to consider what might have been going on Yaff's mind. He might have been worried about what any actions he took might have resulted in consequences for the other enslaved people in Trent's household. And he might have had his own values, own personal beliefs about human life and whether it was appropriate to murder anyone. We don't know, but we need to consider those as well as the fear factor that the laws were intended to create. So, a couple of observations. The history of enslavement is linked with racial disparities and racial divisions today. Things that you might want to think about is, what are beliefs today about people of African descent, and how are they similar or different from those of colonial times? how does the fear of resistance and retribution that existed in colonial times, how is that similar perhaps to some of the fear that prompts the laws and punishments and police actions today? Um, Preserving your economic and political status is a powerful motivator for one group of people keeping another group of people down. And what limitations on opportunities such as education and property ownership have continued uh, in maybe in different forms, in variety of forms, from colonial times and the history of slavery. So I hope that this was an interesting presentation to you and that you have an opportunity to think about and discuss some of these issues and observations. Thank you very much.